Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Podcast Unflooded. It's been for us a couple weeks actually since recording. But for you, who knows? Maybe it's only been a week or two. Who knows? But welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. We have all kinds of new things to discuss. We've gotten We've got suggested topics to discuss. Thanks to you.
Yeah. My name is Alexander. That's Joe, if you didn't know. And yeah, we're happy to be back. Joe has been really working hard, folks, behind the scenes. And I can't stress enough the absolute backlog this man has been creating for the Wind Waker Unflooded fans. And yeah, we're back at a podcast episode. And I'm really excited about this one because we're going to be really talking about Wind Waker. And we're going to be talking about a potential, what we would like to see in a Wind Waker 2, or just sort of a spiritual successor. Say, Nintendo wanted to go back to a sort of island-hopping, great sea adventure. What would we want out of that?
Exactly right. And this topic came out of suggestions. Callum's Army left a comment wanting us to just kind of discuss some of the beta and cut content. And of course, famously, one of the main ideas that were cut from Wind Waker was allegedly 2 dungeons. But the Zelda series, they kept making games. So, it's, I know sometimes that's a big point of discussion I see in like the Wind Waker community is like, what would those 2 dungeons be? I don't know. I don't despair over that just because they kept making Zelda games with dungeons. But I guess I guess I would like to just kind of ask though, it's like in a Zelda game though, where we were still on the ocean, where it's not just about what could the next dungeons be. It's like, what more would we have wanted from a Wind Waker experience?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because, Callum's Army left a great comment. It was something that we kind of went back and forth on because it was like, I personally don't know a lot about the beta for Wind Waker. And Joe says, I'm trusting on this, that there isn't really a lot we know a whole lot about, except that, there are some dungeons cut. And so it was very much the blind maybe leading the blind, and we just kind of started to reframe it as talking about Wind Waker 2 and what we'd want. And I think there is a lot of kind of initial stuff that most people want, right? Like maybe we want it to be larger, more enemies, more dungeons, more bosses, more items and abilities. I mean, that all kind of goes without saying. But I don't know, Wind Waker was interesting to me because as a kid, and I think that still is the case, there aren't really a lot of games that feel like they're open world ocean games, if that makes sense. What comes to mind is there's, of course, the Assassin's Creed Black Flag game and Sea of Thieves kind of, but they're very different from that Wind Waker style of gameplay.
Yeah, they are really different. And to me too, it's like what's great about it being an open world ocean game, are the islands themselves, right? It's like, what do you find on the islands? And to me, like, if there's anything that Wind Waker is missing, I don't think it's missing many things structurally, and talking about its dungeons, I think it's a pretty full-length Zelda game, especially compared to some of the newer games that have been released that, only have like 4 main dungeons. Wind Waker has more than 4. Like, it feels like a fully fleshed out, plenty of unique boss fights, plenty of unique dungeons with, great puzzles in them. But to me, I think like what could have been missing is more just like, well, what are on those islands? And it's like there's only really one main town with Windfall Island. There's a couple of other small settlements here and there, but it's like I would have loved like, 3 more islands just as big as Windfall, for instance.
Yeah. I think that's the tough balancing act is in a open world game that focuses on being on an ocean, right? You've got the islands themselves, and then you've got the ocean itself. And, in many times, or in many of those games, it can sometimes feel like the ocean is just sort of like, it's the in-between the action, right? Like you're sailing from island to island, and that's where a lot of the juicy stuff is. And that's fair, but I also think there's ways to sort of make the ocean exciting. You can have encounters on the ocean. I know, Wind Waker kind of has that with like you have the giant octo rock you can find and stuff like that. And I think about in other games like Assassin's Creed and stuff, you can do whaling, which I don't know if I'd want that in the Wind Waker, but you've got undersea like shipwrecks and stuff you can swim around in, and so I think just adding content to the ocean itself, so it doesn't just feel like, oh, I have to like travel in between the interesting points of the game. I think there's that density of things to do and explore that doesn't feel like it's been lessened by adding a huge ocean into the game.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I remember being a kid playing, doing, it. What am I trying to say? Like, I hear a lot of people complain about the sailing, is I guess what I hear. I hear a lot of people say there's just nothing to do on the water. But yeah, like you said, there's so many other things to come across. But even so, it's I think that rhythm of, finding something and then letting yourself sail. You don't have to be super active on the controller. I think it's a really nice rhythm of allowing a little bit of downtime, right? Where, someone else can be in the room and you're talking about like, where are you going to go next, right? And you can have those discussions, or I don't know, like put the controller down for a second and just watch watch Link sail. Like I don't think that's explicitly a bad thing. I think I think about this with movies all the time, right? It's like that's a more passive activity, right? I think it's okay for games to say like, let's take a second and breathe before we get into the next like high activity moment.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's actually a really good point. I think it's kind of okay to have downtime and have time to, recollect on everything you've been experiencing in the game and sort of just like getting to take in the visuals or the soundtrack. That's very important. And I think games don't have to be like high octane all the time. And if they are, they can often get kind of like, okay, I need to take a break after like maybe an hour or two. So having built-in downtime is great. And yeah, I mean, I think for me, like what I'd want out of a Wind Waker 2 in terms of like stuff to do on the ocean, it's not really much, because like I mentioned the giant Octorok, but there's also like the ghost ship, and I think you find that like submarine. So there's all kinds of like things to still do, and I really wouldn't say that I need much more. I think just a few more interesting encounters and unique encounters are always great. It's always nice to find something in a game, especially an open world game where it's like there's nothing else in the world kind of like this that I've just stumbled upon. And so, yeah, I think you can definitely still have that sort of, the ocean maybe is not going to be as exciting as the islands, right? I'm not necessarily saying we need Bokoblin pirate ships constantly harassing you, but I wouldn't say no to that because that sounds fun. But yeah, totally agree with your point.
Yeah. I guess that's why like it's hard for me sometimes to think about like I would love this Zelda series to go back to another ocean game, but it's also like I was satisfied with the Wind Waker. In another way, it's like if I was going to get Wind Waker 2, I'd want it to do everything it did right. And it did so many things right, and that's hard to like get into in this video without just becoming a review. But anything that I'd want more of is I think more of what it does well and more together. And I think bigger islands is something that would be really interesting, I think, within its format even. I don't know. I think about like, I guess what I love about like a great Zelda map is when the overworld itself is kind of a dungeon. I don't know if everyone agrees with that, but I think Link's Awakening is a good example, off the top of my head, of a way where there's a lot of kind of gates throughout the world in different ways. And Wind Waker is kind of like this. There's some places you can't go to until you have your hook shot, or you can't go there until you have bombs and you can explode a rock in the way. There's all kinds of little things like this where there's like kind of gates throughout the world that you have to keep track of. I don't know. I think about like Phantom Hourglass had like giant reefs and barriers that would get in the way of the ocean itself. And there were these giant walls that would take up, they'd go for, there would be these huge walls, and we never had anything like that in Wind Waker. So I don't know, like I think you could definitely do a console game with some of the stuff Phantom Hourglass did. I enjoyed Phantom Hourglass, and I do like see that as a Wind Waker sequel, for sure. But it's also like it's more of a sequel, I feel like, to the 2D Zelda games and A Link to the Past. And I'd love to see some of its conventions within the conventions of 3D Zelda, for sure.
Yeah, there are dozens of us Phantom Hourglass fans. We will not be silenced. But yeah, and I do get what you mean about sort of being satisfied with Wind Waker, because I think in a lot of ways, what I would want out of a Wind Waker sequel is like, I almost don't know if I want it to be a Zelda game on the water. I don't know. I might just be craving like another ocean game, but I do really like Zelda's like dungeons, and I like the sort of the lore and characters. And so like it would be kind of cool to explore another Hyrule that is just like, you know, it is an archipelago or whatever. It's a bunch of islands. But it's just sort of interesting because I think about Tears of the Kingdom reintroducing these sky islands, right? And those are really fun. And I think we've talked maybe before about how like when Skyward Sword first came out, we kind of thought that it was mostly going to be islands, you know, and there was going to be a lot of, you know, Wind Waker-esque, like sailing from island to island or flying from island to island, rather. And I do wonder if you could do kind of a Wind Waker 2 that is in those, set in that sky Hyrule almost, but does play a bit more like Wind Waker. Maybe there isn't like a ground you can go to and you just have these larger islands where you have dungeons and towns.
Yeah, no, I agree. And like, I guess the reality is like the Wind Waker is part of the series, right? You know, like Twilight Princess is Wind Waker 2. Skyward Sword is Wind Waker 2. You know, Tears of the Kingdom is Wind Waker 2 in very much a way. And I think bringing back islands, even as sky islands, I guess like does satisfy that. So I don't want to like have all these discussions of, oh, if only we got Wind Waker 2. Like we really are, you know, we really are getting Wind Waker 2s. You know, all the time, as long as the Zelda series keeps going. But I guess definitely, like, there is a difference between the islands of the Wind Waker and the islands of Skyward Sword, like you said, and the Sky Islands of Tears of the Kingdom. Those are handled differently than Skyward Sword and different from the Wind Waker Islands. And I don't necessarily want to get too spoilery into Tears of the Kingdom, because there's a lot of people still playing it, and I don't necessarily want to say too much. I think you're still playing it. I am curious, I guess, like in comparing the Sky Islands of that game to the others, and I think it's leagues above Skyward Sword. We've talked about like traversal being a main part of that as well, and that's something Wind Waker didn't even have. I guess like it's similar in that, like I said, Wind Waker had certain gates. There's islands you needed a hook shot to get to, for example. But Tears of the Kingdom, I think, has a really interesting way of the way it gates its islands, with the fact of island height being a core part of it, right? Like in order to get to an island, you have to be able to reach it, you know, no matter how high it is, and have enough energy on some kind of craft to get up to it. And that's not actually that easy to do.
Yeah. And that's, I guess, I'm glad you kind of circled back around to the sort of the idea of gating off or having some linearity where it's like, okay, you can only do certain things on certain islands with these certain items. Because it's an interesting conversation. And it's tough because I think there's a way to make it work, but I know it's also, especially with like larger open worlds, it is always kind of disappointing when like, oh, I was able to kind of get here, but because I'm missing an item, I kind of feel like I've been locked off of doing this this interesting thing in the world. And I do think Tears of the Kingdom kind of does it really well, where it is about like, it feels like if you can get to it, you can do it, you know? It doesn't feel like you're missing an item. It's about like, have you been, you know, working on upgrading your battery, your Zonai battery? Have you been doing that? You know, have you been going to these, the various towers in the game so you can kind of jump up and really get up high and try and see if you can, you know, just glide there. I think it does that really well. And yeah, I think you know, it kind of goes back to that sort of linearity versus, you know, pure like exploration that I think is a discussion within the Zelda community, which is always tough. But I do like your suggestions.
Yeah. No, I like the way you say that too, that comparing item gates to height gates, in that sense that you know, it's not very satisfying when there's actually no way with your current progress to beat a challenge. And even though you know, you can still find those gates and find that you're not ready to find it yet, it is more rewarding when you can reach that gate and you know, oh, it's not just that I literally can't do it. It's literally a skill issue or a preparedness issue, and I can come back and it's not a ooh gotcha moment. It's a test that you can pass later. You just haven't passed it yet. And I do like Tears of the Kingdom's twist on that. And Skyward Sword didn't even have that. Like it I don't know that there was a single island that you couldn't reach, you know, from the start of the game, except for you know, there's like a storm that parts during the course of the story. So it's not like, and there's like chests that appear as you unlock them in the overworld too. So there are things that change on the sky, but it's definitely not handled the same way.
Yeah. And I don't know, like I said, I think there's a lot of ways to do it. And I do think that, to me, of hypothetical Wind Waker 2, like I'd want it to take from these newer Zelda games and be kind of more open and have, different transportation options. I think it'd be kind of fun to play around with, like, maybe you have a little portable boat, right, that you can, use, but are there different types of boats you can use? Is there sort of a almost public transportation system, or could you use like barges or ferries to get around? So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think there's a lot to learn from these newer games, but there is so much just about, like, I guess we just talked about, I think Wind Waker is such a solid game, and I feel very satisfied with it as well. And I'm almost kind of wondering, like I said, if I just want more ocean open world games, because I think it's actually a really cool concept. And maybe someday we'll get open world river games. I mean, let's do more bodies of water, folks.
I agree. Yeah, no, I love river systems, and that's something that I do think even like the Breath of the Wild map could have used more of. And I think that that's a great way of both segmenting the map, and like that becomes a traversal system on its own. And to me, like I think that with that in mind, I'd rather that replace a warp system as well. And I don't know how controversial that is, but I don't know. Like I think I've been frustrated sometimes by just being able to warp anywhere. But I do think, like, as you explore more of the world, it does make sense to be able to travel there more quickly. But I don't know. It's like I wouldn't mind if that's replaced by some kind of in-universe, like, oh, hop on a train or ride down the river. And now it's more convenient because you've unlocked more of the map. But I don't know. Like, I don't necessarily always enjoy just being able to hop anywhere you can. And I guess that is, like, it's always up to the player to choose that path, So I don't know. Maybe I'm complaining about nothing, but... or sometimes I do feel that when I'm playing some of these newer Zelda games.
Yeah, fast travel is actually quite an interesting discussion, because I've seen games sort of start to crack down on it and say, like, oh, like, you do have to use kind of an in-universe transportation. Like, I think about Red Dead Redemption 2 being where, like, you can kind of you can pay for a train ticket or a stagecoach to take you to various settlements. And you can kind of skip over the ride. Like, you can actually just watch the ride play out in real time, which is kind of scenic and fun, but you can just skip it, and that's your fast travel. And I remember not really liking it at first. I was like, man, I just kind of want to go across the map. But there was so much stuff in that game, and there was so many fun, both marked and unmarked locations on the map that was genuinely just, like, worth exploring. Like, I'll never forget when I stumbled upon, like, going to my main objective, like an old abandoned house. And I was like, oh, I wonder if I can get in somehow. And the door was locked, and I, climbed up onto the roof and went through a window, and there was a Frankenstein monster of different animal parts being built. And I was like, this is an insane thing I just discovered. And I would not have discovered it if I had just, like, because I was going to a location I had previously been to, right? It wasn't like but I'd gone kind of a different way. And that's a cool thing, and I think that definitely taught me a little bit more about, like, just wanting to be in the world in real time and experience it. And I think, since then, I replayed Skyrim, and I didn't really fast travel when I did that, and I've had a lot of fun. And and I think it's something that, like, I'm able to kind of limit myself, but I did kind of appreciate the limit being put on me that made me experience that new way of playing.
And, I get that that's tough as a game designer to accommodate with so many different audiences that all have their own preferences, and I can make peace with that. That's something where, and we've talked about this before with other aspects of Zelda, that there are things where I'm okay with compromising if more people are able to share the series. And ultimately, I think I do feel that way, that, like, I'd rather be able to share Zelda, even if there's some of my personal preferences that don't get met every time. Because usually if it sticks to the core of the series, which is, I think, I mean, so many things, but as an adventure game, if it captures that spirit, whatever you think the essence of Zelda is, I mean, there's a lot of, I could get deeper into that because I think it gets more personal than that. But as long as that's captured, I feel like usually I'm happy, even if they go in a completely different direction. But yeah, I think we are getting to the end of our time, give or take. I think we're wrapping up these videos just a little bit earlier. I mean, there's so many more things we could talk about. And in this discussion, I guess, like, looking back on it, Alex, it's, I mean, what we want from a new Zelda game, that's part of it. What we want from another ocean experience. And there's so many more things to keep discussing, because pirate systems, you know, like treasure system, there's so many more things to discuss, maybe, in future episodes of this podcast.
Yeah. We need 10 episodes on ocean games, folks. If you could please support our endeavors to have 10 podcast episodes. Because, yeah, it's something I could keep talking about, like you said. I mean, I would love to get into nitty gritty about systems and sort of, you know, all kinds of different game design things. But, you know, as, you know, like you said, we only got so much time. And, but it would be, I think I have, you know, ideas about what I'd want to talk about maybe in the next episode, like you said.
Yeah, and we'll get into it then. I guess that's something, you know, just reflecting on it. It's like thinking about this conversation. It's like I want to provide value. I want to get into depth, but that's why we're just doing more episodes, and we're starting here in the conversation. The conversation will return in the next episode of Wind Waker Unflooded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think we got a couple minutes. I don't know. Is there any closing thoughts we want to talk about before we, you know, finish up?
Yeah, that's a great question. We do have just enough time to remind you to leave comments down below about what else what other topics do you want us to cover, any suggestions for the Wind Waker Unflooded project itself, any questions you have for us, you know, anything you just want to hear us talk about in reference to Nintendo and to Zelda, to Wind Waker, to anything, because we'll go off topic. We're not afraid to. We've done it before, and we'll do it again. We'll do it right now.
And that's a threat, you know?
Yeah. I mean, you know, that's all I gotta say. Alex, you know, how do you feel? Any closing thoughts?
I guess not. Just happy to keep doing this. I think it's been a nice outlet as an excuse to talk, and I always look forward to the next one. Hopefully, I mentioned earlier the backlog. Maybe we'll, in a couple days, get a chance to record some more of those, and, you know, make some progress. They have some interesting episodes, I think. And thank y'all for the comments. Like, Callum's Army left a great comment that I know kind of didn't really cover maybe what he had suggested, but it was helpful in getting we kind of talked about it back and forth, and we were like, you know, we kind of want to talk about this part of, you know, so it is very helpful. Just genuinely, like, we encourage people to say, like, it doesn't have to be Zelda related. If someone suggested do a pasta podcast episode of I would do it so quickly, actually.
I'd do it too. Exactly. I mean, the shapes, man, there's so many shapes.
Mm-hmm. And it's, I mean, you know, the history of pasta is quite fascinating. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's a famous Italian dish, but where did they get the tomatoes?
Mm-hmm.
Where did the tomato?
I wonder if they didn't have tomatoes before the Great Exchange, as I like to call it.
The Great Exchange.
I forgot there was a term in history class about the exchange of, like, different, you know, plants and animal species from, like, the Americas to Europe and Africa and such.
Mm-hmm.
But I forget the term, and so we call it the Great Exchange.
The Great Exchange. But yeah, I'm just a reminder, Italians, you're welcome.
Mm-hmm.
Can I say that? Can I say that publicly?
I'm happy to report that, and I can say that because I'm Italian American, so I can say a lot of things.
Cheers to that.
Cheers to that. But yeah, thank y'all for watching. Won't take up any more of your time. Thank you so much for listening, especially if you've gotten to the end of the podcast. And peace and love from us to you.
Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next one.